Hello, this is Reverend Dr. Gregory A. Jones bringing you another session on African American religious experience. I want you to concentrate on, in this session, virtue theories of Africans coming to America. I will put on the for your convenience the article done by an author named Peter J. Parrish. He wrote a book called The Spirituality of African Peoples. And I'm going to put a chapter on there on virtue theory. I think it's a very important aspect of understanding how the spirituality of Africans evolved in the African American presence in America. We will go into depth with regard to the value systems that were maintained by Africans who were found themselves in America. These values are key to the foundation of the black church and of the African American religious experience. As I said, Dr. Peter Parrish authored this work, The Spirituality of African Peoples, suggests that the virtue theory of African people were retained by Africans when they were brought to the Americas, despite the hardships and the horrific experience of slavery and enslavement. These Africans were able to hold on to some basic virtues that find themselves in the development and the evolution of the African American religious experience. And we still see these virtues and values in play today in the African American community. The diaspora, the African diaspora, which is the dispersal of Africans throughout the global community, is what we will be concentrating on. But specifically now, we are setting our goal and focus in on Africans who have arrived and are in America now. And what we're looking at is how the foundations of spirituality developed throughout the evolution of the African American religious experience. We will begin this session with a brief look at Dr. Parrish's concepts of the virtue theory. The basis of the cosmological center of African life, that is, that which we understand as the cosmos, or that which is the seat of being for Africans in America, has changed dramatically, and under the duress and the duress of slavery and horrific kind of treatment, that context has changed. However, the foundational value systems that Africans had was retained, and we want to take a look at that today. The preservation and promotion of community has always been a key and central part of this cosmological concept. In other words, I am because we are, which is a Kemetic kind of notion. I talked to you about that earlier in the session. Is still at the root of Africans, and as they understand and are trying to navigate the context of this this notion of slavery and this notion of this horrific kind of treatment that that's taking place in their lives. And so they're struggling, but they're drawing forth from this very basic value system that they have. And we want to take a look at that. These virtues that we will review will seen as the locus or the center of the value system that Africans have evolved in the context of slavery. This construction of divine order, if you will, within the evolution of the spirituality of Africans comes with the immersion of this notion of divine with these very basic values and concepts of humanity, of completed humanity, divine human order that personifies for the early African in the Christological notion of who the person of Christ is. So when we see Africans becoming Christian, they look at Jesus as completed humanity, or the most perfected humanity. But this comes from these values that are partaked in terms of, or placed very deeply into the psyche and into the spirituality of Africans way before they get here to America, and they retain it, they hold on to it. And so we're going to look at some of the perceptions of some of these values and how these values present themselves in the behaviors of Africans in their stay in the Americas and as they evolve into the American continent. These virtues all reflect a complete humanness, a completed humanity, as I've said before. And I want to list out the 6 virtues so that you'll understand how these virtues begin to play a part in the behaviors. I want you to notice also that I have jazz playing in the background of this session, and jazz is one of the attributes that we're going to take a look at as relates to improvisation for Africans in America. So I want you to do a couple of things in this session. Number one, I want you to understand the multitasking nature of how these values interact with one another, but I also want you to pay attention to the creative aspect, the improvisational aspect that is being utilized even in the now time as we try to present these virtues to you. Okay, the virtues themselves. Beneficence, spelled B-E-N-E-F-I-C-E-N-C-E, beneficence. Forbearance, F-O-R-B-E-A-R-A-N-C-E. Practical wisdom, improvisation, forgiveness, justice, and finally, public and private ethics. Again, beneficence, forbearance, practical wisdom, improvisation, forgiveness, justice, and public and private ethics are what we'll be reviewing today. Okay, so let's go with beneficence. Beneficence, caring for others before you care for yourself. A greater compassion for the community than for your own family, or a similar compassion for the community as you have for your family is what we're talking about with beneficence. A concern and extension of family. So when you go into the African and African American community, everyone is an uncle or a brother or a sister or a mom or a dad or a mother or a father. These relationships are extended out into the community. The example I want you to set is when my mother was younger, when we were younger, my mom would allow my brothers and sisters to eat breakfast. And we had very little. We had maybe two eggs between 5 children, and maybe 2 or 3 pieces of toast, and that was breakfast. And we had a little milk and maybe water. And my mom would allow us to eat breakfast, and she would literally eat the crumbs and the edges of the bread that we left, and she would gather that and make that her breakfast. In other words, she denied herself so that her children could eat. That is an act of beneficence. When you would put yourself in self-denial, that is to say, denial of those things that maybe would feed you or clothe you, and you give that away to another, is an act of beneficence. Now, we look at this in a larger context when we see people who are as opposed to seeking riches for themselves, make sure that the community grows with their growth. In other words, you give to others more than you give to yourself. There's an act of beneficence that was very present in the early African American community. Of course, we see now that there is a loss of beneficence, and then there's more competitiveness now and class issues now than ever before in the African American community. But if you go to the masses of African American people, if you go to the African American poor, you will still see beneficent acts taking place in the African American community, especially with the extension of brothers and sisters and family members in the life community. I heard from a friend that told me that he went to Africa, and he said that as he landed in Africa, the young man that met him simply said that, "You are my uncle, you are part of my family, you're part of my household. You cannot buy anything to feed yourself. You cannot stay in a hotel. You must stay in my house with my family because you are a family member." That value system is an aspect of beneficence. The second one that we want to look at today is called forbearance. Forbearance. This means the endurance of suffering, the endurance of hardship, with a notion that things are going to be better later on. You will be greater later. The idea that despite the context of slavery, despite the context of racism and discrimination, that you will eventually overcome that. But you must be patient. You must be able to hold yourself together until your change comes. We hear that often in the church. Hold on till a change comes. God is going to deliver if you just be patient. Be patient with me. God has not finished with me yet. We talk about the notion of keeping your cool under duress and stress. In other words, when you see the African American, oftentimes the negative is portrayed. Well, you know, they don't get excited about anything. They seem like they're nonchalant. That's not the issue. The issue is that there's a virtue, an African virtue, coming into play. The virtue that's coming into play is forbearance. I am not going to let you disrupt me. I'm not going to let you take me out of my game. I'm not going to let those things that you are doing to distress and to diminish my humanity stop me from keeping my cool and being able to eventually overcome whatever oppression, whatever stressful situation or critical junction in my life has come to be. Forbearance. Very, very key to the survival, the pragmatic goal of survival for the African American, certainly for the African brought to America during these times and until today. We still see the forbearing African community. We know, for example, that drugs don't always come out of the African American community into the African American community. We know that there are other forces at work that are causing structural unemployment and poverty and duress and distress within our communities. Yet we still keep our cool with the notion that ultimately the ultimate goal of justice, which we will talk about later, is going to be met. Practical wisdom. This is the third one. Practical wisdom is excellent thought that guides action, good action, survival skills. In other words, the respect for elders and intelligence and wisdom, discernment of the ability to think yourself out of situation. The practical wisdom is a sense of self in such a way that you are able to think yourself through the crisis that you find yourself in, into a position of survival and safety, keeping good insight and keeping an understanding. Practical wisdom, for example, and let me give you the example of natural herbs. In the olden days, for example, as Africans come to America, they find that they don't have the medicinal herbs that they need in order to heal themselves. And instead of panicking, they begin to look at the foliage, and they begin to look at the plant life, and they begin to find ways to heal themselves through the plant life. We find medicinal herbs like sage and dandelions and poke salad. My wife is a herbist, and she has the ability to look at plants and consider how plants can do healing. We talk about garlic bringing down high blood pressure. We talk about something called bone knitter that helps in the knitting of broken bones. This is also adapted from Native American culture that plays a part in giving to the African that comes to America some of the remedies that are necessary. Collard greens, for example. People look at collard greens and say, oh, yeah, they're just eating collard greens. That's just soul food. But a collard green can grow from early April and stay alive until a hard frost in December or maybe January. In other words, a plant that can almost stay alive the entire year as a source of sustenance and mineral health. The medicinal nature of the kinds of things that Africans did in a practical wisdom way in order to survive and to supplant racism is what we're talking about here. So it's not just a matter of making good decisions in front of adversity, but it's also the ability to have intelligent discernment, to be able to say, okay, I see where my situation is, I see what I need to do. We see it happening every day with our African American students here at the university, who oftentimes find themselves financially unable to meet the goals that they need to meet, but with ingenuity and with a lot of suave and verb and ability to ingenuity, they survive and they thrive, and they ultimately are found victorious in graduating and moving on with their lives, despite the kind of resistance and sometimes structures that are opposing their ability to function in such communities. We appreciate the value system of practical wisdom, which takes us to what you're hearing on the radio. You hear on the radio the music playing in terms of jazz, and I want to talk to you about improvisation. Improvisation is a moral virtues coupled with novelty, the use of proverbs to develop ethical guidelines to be used on a day-to-day basis is one aspect of improvisation. That way, a play on words, a play on stories, so that you can learn. When we talk about Aesop, we're talking about, you know, an African proverbist that is giving basically notions of ethics and ways in which to surmount these conditions that you're in an intelligent and inventive way. Jazz is a reoccurring theme with variation. I want you to understand that jazz is a specific art form that was created here in America it is very African. It is very much a part of the virtue of improvisation. That's a theme that's running, and then a variation with various instruments that play in and out of that theme is an excellent example of improvisation and the use of improvisation. A unique music from created specifically within a rubric and a variation and theme, then back to theme again. Jazz, blues, rap, gospel are all art forms that use improvisation, the theme and variation of theme, as a way to show improvisational kind of ability. But not only that, when we see, if you watch, for example, the other example I would like to give you is young children who have to wear uniforms. They will never wear the uniform the same way. Each person puts their own spin on the uniform if they go into school, for example. And number one, they are rejecting the notion to be uniformed at the school, but because it's an obligation for them, they're going to leave one sock down and one sock up. They're going to put their hat on a certain way. They're going to wear the vest a certain way. Improvisation, making the reality your own in an improvisational kind of way, putting your signature on your style in life. We see that as a virtue in terms of Africans and African Americans here. Moving on. Now, we have two more that we're going to look at. Or three more we're going to look at. One is forgiveness. Forgiveness or reconciliation is a key component to maintain community. Learning how and why and when to forgive for the good of community. We see forgiveness as a part of the virtues of African American people. Justice, which is a foundational one for the virtues, because it affects and directs the virtues of all the others. For beyond civil law and common good, it is inclusive equality. It is the ultimate goal. It is the human treatment of all, community, no harm to anyone, and the well-being of all is what we want to look at in terms of justice. Justice kind of leads the rest of the pack in terms of the virtues. And then finally, public and private ethics. And I'll end with this. Your public goals for community must match, Peter Parrish says, your private actions. In other words, and he uses Martin Luther King Jr. and he uses Nelson Mandela as examples of how the public ethics and the private ethics match with these two great leaders, and how they present themselves and display themselves in issues of justice and issues of policy for community through their public and private ethics. Their public ethic and private ethic has to match. When it doesn't match, then generally your public life takes a fall. And we can see many African Americans and many members of our society who they say one thing publicly, but they are something else privately, and generally it reacts negatively in the community. When that happens in our community, generally what we do is back up from the support of that individual, and we essentially say to ourselves is that, you know, he's having a rough time, he's in a rough journey, and when that person resets himself or herself back into the public private ethics, then we embrace them again. I want to stop there with these 7 virtues. I want you to pay close attention to them, and we will also look at the paperwork in relationship to the Peter Parrish chapter 2 in regards to these 7 fundamental African virtues. I'll see you next time.